In introducing Rabbi Siev, I'll point to a brief passage that is easily overlooked in this week's parsha, in Parshas Va'era, in which the Torah offers almost an aside before it records Moshe and Aaron's extended dialogues with Paro. Before Moshe and Aaron speak to Paro, and the Torah records all the back and forth, there's a brief passage where the Torah says, "Ve'ela b'nei Levi, Shemos b'nei Levi," gives us a whole recorded history of the genealogy, of the lineage of Moshe and Aaron, Levi, Kahas, etc., all the way through Moshe and Aaron. And the Torah concludes, "Who Aaron and Moshe?" That's the Aaron and Moshe that spoke to Paro at the behest of Hashem. And Rashi talks about why it mentions the Bnei Levi there. Perhaps it's in order to give us a calculation as to how long the Sheep of Mitzrayim is going to last. But at face value, it seems like the Torah is subtly communicating an important message. If you want to understand who someone is, you need to understand where they came from. And that's a critical component of who they are and all that they do and all that they contribute to the Jewish people. In order to understand the contributions of Moshe and Aaron, you need to first understand where they came from. That's something that the Tanakh communicates in other places as well. The Ibn Ezra says that the whole purpose of Sefer Rus is just to explain to us the lineage and history of David HaMelech. If you want to understand David HaMelech and all of his contributions to Klal Yisrael, you need to understand the chesed and devotion to Jewish people and to Hashem that was his roots. And I think what emerges from that is that, A, you can understand a lot about a person and where they came from, but a natural corollary of that is it's a major reflection on where that person came from when you can see the fruits that came from a family, a place, and a community. I have said many, many times that it is an immense point of pride for me as the Marda Asra of this Kehillah of Bnei Yeshurun, just to look at the amazing number of Jewish leaders, teachers of Torah, Talmidei Chachamim, really banner carriers for Klal Yisrael that have come from this Kehillah. And when I say that, just to state the abundantly obvious, when I say that I take pride in that, I obviously do not mean that I take any credit for that. I am a newcomer to this community. I certainly was not the Marda Asra when Rabbi Siev was growing up in this community. But as a point of communal pride, it's a point of pride for me, and it should be a point of pride for all of you as well, to just look at the amazing number of, again, leaders and teachers of Torah and Torah scholars that were nurtured by our Kehillah, that grew up in the walls of this shul. And really central among them is our speaker this morning. Rabbi Siev is a fantastic Talmid Chacham, a teacher of Torah, a Rabbi at Yeshivat Levat Torah, which is a yeshiva that I've become very fond of in recent years as I've learned more about Levat Torah and spoken to many of its Rebbeim and alumni. It has become clear to me that Levat Torah is not just a yeshiva, it's really an entire community, one that really creates a place for Olim, for Chayalim Bodedim. It's an incredibly important institution. It's now a yeshivat has there as well. And Rabbi Siev is just a remarkably eloquent and sophisticated teacher of Torah that is, in many ways, a reflection of where he came from. Of course, his parents, Yassi and Ruthie, who are here today. And also, it's just an immense point of pride for our Kehillah more broadly, as being one of those Torah leaders and teachers of Torah and one who carries on our Masorah. And it's, again, indeed an immense point of pride and a reflection on our Kehillah, something that we should all be proud of. So it's a great schus for us this morning to welcome Rabbi Siev back to Kehillas B'nai Yeshurun, and it's a great schus for us to hear words of Torah from him this morning. Rabbi Siev.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shriver, for the very, very kind words. And really, Teaneck B'nai Yeshurun in specific is a place that's very close to my heart. And having grown up here and gained so much from this community, really is very special to be able to come back and share some Torah together, learn some Torah together. And it's just so beautiful to see that this community just doesn't stop growing and developing. And over the course of so many years, it just keeps on getting stronger and more finely developed in the area of Torah and every other way as well, and should just continue. Incredibly apropos that Rabbi Schreier spoke about roots. I certainly consider this to be a place where I have strong roots and where I really grew up. But it also happens to be my grandfather's yard site today. And he spent his later years here in this shul in B'nai Yeshurun. So it's a special opportunity to share Torah on his yard site. It should be Le'ili Nishmasa of Asher ben Rabbi Yeshua. And if possible as well, okay, our topic today is, I think, a fascinating topic, a really interesting topic, which speaks to some of the critical issues of just how we understand the process of psak halacha and just the world of Torah in general. It's one of these sodei ha'amuna that Torah is mishamayim, that Kosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah mishamayim. To what extent is that process ongoing? To what extent is that a historical point, and then that stage ended, and now there's no room for further intervention mishamayim in determining psak halacha? That is our topic for today. It says here Kabbalah Ruach HaKodesh and the limits of psak. We're going to get to Kabbalah at the end. We'll start with other aspects Ruach HaKodesh and the like. So there's a famous klal in halacha. The Gemara says over and over again, Lo bashamayim hi. The Gemara says it first and most famously in source number 1 on the sheet, Gemara Maseches Bava Metzia. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the piece is here for those who want to see it. But the Gemara discusses the famous case of tanur shel achnai. So a certain type of an oven, a tanur, and the question is it susceptible to tumah or not? Is it possible to become tameh? And Rabbi Eliezer says no, it can't become tameh. And the Chacham disagree, and they have this unresolvable machlokas. Nobody can convince the other side that they're right. And Rabbi Eliezer starts to go ahead and give and ask for miraculous interventions to prove he's correct. So Rabbi Eliezer says the halacha is like me. This carob tree should prove it, and then the carob tree gets uprooted and it goes 100 amos, incredible. And they say we don't pass on halacha based on a carob tree. And the river should go upstream, and the river goes upstream, and the walls of the Beis Medrash should close in, and in fact that happens. And then until the Chacham said to Rabbi Yeshua says stop it, And finally, towards the end of this Gemara, if you look in the last four complete lines in the middle of the line, Chazav Amar Lehem, Im halacha kemosi min hashamayim yochichu. The halacha is like me; it should be proven in Shemayim. Yatzis a baskol v'amra malachem etzer Rabbi Eliezer shalacha kemosa b'chol makom. Why are you disagreeing with Rabbi Eliezer? Why are you giving him a hard time? The halacha always follows Rabbi Eliezer. So that's what the baskol said, a heavenly voice. And Omar Rabbi Yeshua Ragla v'Omar lo b'shamayim hi. This Torah is no longer in heaven. My lo b'shamayim. The Gemara says, what does that mean? Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah shekvar nitna Torah me'ar Sinai ein onu mashkichin bevaskol. The Torah was already given. Hashem gave us the rules for interpreting Torah, for determining psak halacha. We don't pay any more attention to heavenly voices. Shekvar kosafta bar Sinai batzora acharei rabim lehatos. You already wrote in the Torah, we go by the majority. The majority of the Chachamim disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore we don't have to listen to this baskol. And the Gemara says, as an afterword, the Gemara says, Ashkechei Rabbi Nasan Lelio. Rabbi Nasan found Elio Hanavi. He met Elio Hanavi. Amar lei, my kavod kutsha berichu b'hai shaita. What's HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing at that time? What was he doing when they had this dispute? And Rabbi Yeshua said, we don't have to listen to the baskol. And Eliyahu Hanavi says to him, Omar lei kochayich ve'omar nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. So to speak, Hashem was smiling and said, my sons have defeated me. Now, this is very fascinating. Here we have Eliyahu Hanavi, essentially, this is Mishamayim, sort of confirming that we don't follow this special communications Mishamayim, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I've been defeated. What a fascinating line, theologically, to understand that. Torah is Mishamayim. We're trying to do Dvar Hashem, trying to fulfill Ritzon Hashem, and Hashem says, okay, you beat me. You're right. You followed the rules that I gave, and even though I communicated X, the halacha is Y, you won, and that is correct. That's the final word, that the Chachamim are the ones who determine the halacha, and it's not from special communications Mishamayim. I'm going to come back to source number 2 in a minute, but this is repeated in other places in the Gemara. So in source number 3, slightly different twists each time. But in source number 3, the Gemara says, in Maseches Temura, Gufa Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shloshes halafim halachos nishachu b'mei evlo shel Moshe. When Moshe died, Bnei Yisrael forgot 3,000 halachos. Amrulo Yoshua Sha'al. So they said to Yeshua, go ahead and ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu what these halachos are. We don't remember. Amar lahu lo b'shamayim hi. He said, it's not in heaven anymore. They said to Shmuel Hanavi, generations later. Why don't you go ahead and ask and find out? Amar lahem, Eila mitzvos she'ein hanavi rashai l'chadish dover me'ata. A navi cannot introduce new halacha. So here, it's not even a machlokas. In the first case, the communication mishamayim contradicted a halachic principle of acharei rabim lahatos, that we follow the majority of the chachamim, and that's where the Gemara says lo b'shamayim. We don't listen to the Baskal. Here, there's no machlokas at all. It's not contradicting a halachic principle of determining halacha. It's not against acharei rabim lahatos. It's just, it doesn't matter. We don't go ahead and try to access special communications mishamayim in order to figure out the halacha. We forgot the halacha. Now it's our problem to go ahead and to figure out what to do. That's what Yoshua says. That's what Shmuel HaNavi says as well. In source number 4, the Gemara in Eruvin relates that David HaMelech is involved with the Plishtim. The Plishtim are coming to attack this town called Keilah. Vehema Shosim Es Agranos. So they were attacking and trying to steal the grain. Bo al Iskei Mamon. And this was on Shabbos. So David HaMelech wants to know, okay, what do we do now? Are we going to go ahead and attack the Plishtim? Are we going to go ahead and defend this town? So it says the following: Vayishal David b'Hashem lemor ha'elech v'kesi bePlishtim ha'ila. So David asks the Urim Tumim, should I go ahead and attack? Vayomer Hashem el David lech v'kesi bePlishtim v'oshates Keilah. Go ahead, attack, and you will save this town of Keilah. So the Gemara says, "My coming by." What was he asking? What was his question that David asked through the Urim Tumim? If the question was, is it permissible to go ahead and engage in battle on Shabbos when they weren't trying to kill people? They were coming to cause monetary damage, to go ahead and to steal the grain, whatever they were doing. The Gemara says that couldn't have been the question to the Urim Tumim. The Beis Din of Shmuel was there. You don't ask the Urim Tumim. You go ahead and you ask the Beis Din of Shmuel HaNavi. Rather, the question was, are we going to be successful? Okay, that's a question that you can ask the Urim V'Tumim. So here again, the Gemara says, Beis Din Shel Shmuel HaRasikayim, the Beis Din is there. You don't go ahead and ask the Urim V'Tumim. We don't listen to the Baskal. We don't ask the Urim V'Tumim. Halacha is determined by human beings based on the principles of Psak. In source number 2, astounding Gemara in Bava Metzia, which I think expresses this in a fascinating way. So listen to this. The Gemara says, "Kom miflagi b'mesifta derakia beheres kodemes l'seir lavan tamei, l'seir lavan kodem lebeheres tahor." So this is the rules of negoim, of tzaras. So one of the examples of tzaras in the Torah is on the body, if there's a blotch of white skin and a white hair in the middle of the blotch, then that's tzaras. But the Gemara says that if the blotch came first and then a hair turns white, that's tzaras. If the hair turned white first, then the person's tar. That's not tzaras. Not tamei with tzaras. And let's say it's a suffix. So then the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer tar v'chulu mesivta derakia amrei tamei. So it's machlokas in Shemayim between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Yeshiva Shel Mala. I don't know how anyone can have a machlokas with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but here you go. The entire Yeshiva Shel Mala says the halacha is tamei, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says tar. So Gemara says, Amri man nochach. So who's going to determine what the bottom line is? HaKadosh Baruch Hu versus the Yeshiva Shel Mala. So how are we going to figure out the bottom line? So where it says nochach Rabba bar Nachmani. So Rabba, the Amor Rabba, he's going to be the one to determine the bottom line. Rabbi bar Nachmani, ani yochid b'negoim, ani yochid b'olos. Rabbi bar Nachmani had a specialty in this area of halacha, of negoim. So the Gemara says, they said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Yeshiva Shel Mala agreed. Okay, Rabba is going to paskin. Rabba was alive. So Shadru Shlicha Basrei. So they send a messenger to come get him. The messenger is the Malach HaMavis. Rabba was just learning constantly. Malach HaMavis can't get you if you're learning 100% of the time. So so then eventually the wind blew. There was a rustle in the trees, and the government was after him for something. So he thought that maybe soldiers were coming. He got scared. He stopped learning for a second, and not only stopped learning. He just said, "I hope I die before the Romans catch me." So perfect opportunity for the Malach Hamavis. He's dying. Tahar. So as he's dying, he says Tahar. He's paskening on this Shaila. Tahar. Yatzas Baskol v'amra Shrecha Rabbi Bar Nachmani Shekufcha Tahar v'yatzas Nishmascha B'Tahar. So a Baskol comes out and says, Rabbi is so amazing and so special. Your guf is Tahar, and you give out your neshama with Tahar. So Rabbi Bar Nachmani paskins on this Shaila between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Yeshiva Shomala. Listen to this point. The Rambam La'alocha and Hilchos Tziras paskins not like HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Rabbi Bar Nachmani. He paskins like the Yeshiva Shomala. So the Kesef Mishnah says, well, what about Rabbi Bar Nachmani paskening like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? So he says, no, but we have a principle that halacha is like a Stam Mishnah, and this is Rabbi's against the Stam Mishnah, so forget it. So we don't paskin this way. I can't think of a more clear demonstration of this principle. You have a machlokas between HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself and the Yeshiva Shomala, and they need Rabbi Bar Nachmani to paskin because he's still alive. And even though Rabbi does paskin, the Rambam comes along and says, okay, but we have our own klalei psak. We don't have to go by Rabbi Bar Nachmani. We don't paskin everything that Rabbi in the Gemara says. Rabbi, of course, one of the greatest Amoraim, but that's not necessarily a bottom line. So halacha has its own principles of psak, not determined by any paschal, by any by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. The Gemara says we might know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself holds X, but that's not what determines the halacha. Determines the halacha is what the Chachamim, with their human intellect, based on the rules of psak. Obviously, you can't manipulate this process and just come up with whatever you want, but using the body of information that the Torah contains and using the principles of halachic determination that the Torah contains, that is how the Chachamim are meant to go ahead and to determine Psak Halacha. And that's how they do determine Psak Halacha. To the point that in source number 5, the Rambam writes, in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, V'cheinim akar davar midvarim shalamani piyah shmua. Osha amar bedin midinei HaTorah sh'Hashem tzivalo sh'adin kach. V'halacha kedivrei ploni. Harei novi hasheker v'yechoneg. This is the rules of a Navi Sheker. The Rambam says, if a person comes along and says, hi, I'm a Navi, and I have a Nevuah that the halacha is X. Even if it's a machlokas, he says, I have a Nevuah that the psak is like this opinion. So we know that's a Navi Sheker. You don't get Nevuah for these kind of things. Navi Sheker will execute him based on the fact that he is a false prophet, a Navi Sheker. Afal Pisha Asaos, even though he does a miracle to go ahead and to prove it. So he's a Navi Sheker. Sharei Bala Hakrisha Torah, She'amra Lo Bashamayim He. He's coming to contradict the Torah. One of the definitions of a Navi Sheker is if you're coming to contradict the Torah, so then that proves that what you're saying is false, and you're a Navi Sheker. And he says, Aval Fisha Shom Lo Bakol. If he's saying, I'm making an exception to Torah law because this is a unique circumstance, okay, so that's built into the halachic system, that there's such a thing as hara shah. There's such a thing as a one-time unique situation which overrides the rules of halacha. But if he's trying to determine the rules of halacha, that's outside of the purview of prophecy, and then we know that he is a Navi Sheker. So this is absolutely clear. Lo bashamayim he. And then we come to a Gemara Maseches Eruvin and Daf Gimel, in source number 6. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel, Shalosh Shanim Nechelku Beisham Veisilel, Halalu Omrim Halach K'moseinu V'Halacha, Halalu Omrim Halach K'moseinu. There was a big dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel for 3 years. And they said, the halach is like us. They said, no, we're right. The halach is like us. Finally, Yatza Baskol V'Amra, Elu V'Elu Divrei Elokim Chayim, V'Halacha K'Beis Hillel. A Baskol comes out and says, listen, it's both Torah, Elu V'Elu Divrei Elokim Chayim, but the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So here we have a Gemara which seems to indicate that the bottom line goes to the Baskol. The Baskol came out and decided that we paskin like Beis Hillel. And that's against everything we've been saying until now. So the Gemara itself asked this question, not on that daf, Yud Gimel, but earlier in Maseches Eruvin, source number 7, on daf Vav, daf Zayin. So the Gemara says the following, that it quotes a Beis on the top line, Vatanya la'olam halakha Beis Hillel. Barot elasos k'divrei Beis Shammai osa, k'divrei Beis Hillel osa. The halacha is like Beis Hillel. Okay? Then it says, seemingly walking that back a little bit, it says, if you want to follow the opinion of Beis Shammai, you can. If you want to follow the opinion of Beis Hillel, you can. Mikula Beis Shammai, Mikula Beis Hillel, Russia. If you just try to take the leniencies of both shittas, both schools, then you're a Russia. You're just looking for leniency, you're not trying to follow halacha. Mechumra Beis Shammai, Mechumra Beis Hillel. If you're trying to take all the chumras, then Alava Kasav Omer Aksil B'Choshech Cholech. The fool walks in darkness. So taking all the chumras also not the appropriate approach. Taking all the kulas is certainly not the appropriate approach. Rather, Ella Ike Beis Shammai Kikulein V'Chumrayon. Ike Beis Hillel Kikulein V'Chumrayon. Choose a side. If you want to be on the Beis Shammai side, you follow the chumras and the kulas of Beis Shammai. If you want to be on the Beis Hillel side, you follow the kulas and the chumras of Beis Hillel. And you're consistent in your approach. So that's the Beis. The Gemara says, "Hagufa kasha amad lo olam halacha Beis Hillel." The Amar harotze lasos k'divrei Beis Shammai yosef. The Gemara says the Beis seems to contradict itself. It starts off by saying the halacha is like Beis Hillel, and then it says, "Well, if you want to do like Beis Shammai, that's fine." So then, in what sense is halacha k'Beis Hillel? How can you say both halacha k'Beis Hillel? But if you want to do like Beis Shammai, that's okay. So Gemara says, "Lo kasha kan kodem baskol kan la'achar baskol." So before the baskol came out, you had the right to choose whether you're a Beis Hillel follower or a Beis Shammai follower. After the baskol, you no longer have that choice. Halacha ke Beis Hillel. That means that the baskol determined the halacha. That's against everything we've been saying until now. Alternatively, the Gemara says, or maybe it's after the baskol. But the first part of the brisa is halacha Beis Hillel. That's because of the baskol, and then after that, it's reflecting the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. He's the one who says we don't listen to baskols. Now this turns us into a machlokas between Rabbi Yeshua and others as to whether we in fact listen to baskols. As you may recall from the first source, Rabbi Yeshua was the one who, in the famous case of Tanur Shalach Nai, where Rabbi Eliezer against the Chachamim, and Rabbi Eliezer says, let heaven prove that I'm right, and a baskol comes out. Rabbi Yeshua is the one who gets up and says, we don't listen to baskols. So now the Gemara is saying, okay, that's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, fine, but not everyone agrees to that. Some apparently hold that we do listen to baskols. So where does this leave us exactly? Do we listen to baskols? Do we not listen to baskols? What's going on? So Tosfos asked this question in source number 8. And Tosfos says the following. Yeah. A baskol, I'm sorry, is a heavenly voice. A voice comes out from heaven and says, Halacha k'Beis Hillel, or Halacha k'Rebbe Eliezer. So do we have to take that into consideration? Where is it? It's a disembodied. What's causing it is it seems to be the Gemara does seem to think that it's a real thing. It's right. A voice goes. I don't know what this is. I've never heard of baskol. Yeah, so that's the chiddush of lo b'shamayim. If it's a real thing, that's why the Gemara in Bava Metzia said that Hashem was smiling and saying, "Nitzchuni banai, my sons defeated me." He's saying, I really think the halacha is X. But you're right. When I gave the Torah, I said there's rules for determining psak. You are following the rules that I gave you, and you have the right to do that. Not only the right, but the responsibility to do that. So just because I'm coming along and saying you got it wrong, that doesn't matter. That's the halacha in Shemayim. That's not the halacha l'maisa in Olam Hazeh. The halacha l'maisa in Olam Hazeh is whatever the Chachamim determine based on the rules of determining halacha. Right? And then that's an incredible thing. Comes out that there is a partnership. Lo b'shamayim means there's a partnership between God and human beings in determining halacha. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the basic principles, the basic information, the principles of how to process that information and reach a conclusion. And then he said, okay, now I'm leaving it in your hands. I'm not going to micromanage how you go ahead and engage in this process. Right? And the halacha, bottom line halacha in this world is whatever the Chacham say. Even if that ends up being against, so to speak, what the psak would be in Shemayim. So that's the concept of Lo B'Shemayim. And that's why the Gemara says we don't listen to this heavenly voice. We don't listen to this baskol. We don't ask the Urim. And the Navi is not allowed to come along and say, here's the following halacha. And nonetheless, the Gemara in Eruvin says that baskol came out and said halacha k'beis Hillel. And the Gemara seems to say, okay, well, it depends. Rabbi Yeshua versus others. Really, it's not so. It's not totally unanimous that we don't listen to baskos. I suppose Rabbi Eliezer also held that we listen to baskos. Maybe it's the Gemara is not coming to a bottom line. The Gemara is saying it's Rabbi Eliezer versus Rabbi Yeshua. Do we listen to baskos or do we not listen to baskos? So Tosfos in source number 8, Tosfos in Eruvin Daf Vav and Beis says, what's going on here? The first answer of the Gemara seems to indicate everyone would agree that we do listen to the baskol. The Gemara says, Kan kodem baskol, kan lacher baskol. Before the baskol came out, you had a right to listen to Beis Shammai. After the baskol, you have no right to listen to Beis Shammai. That means that according to that answer in the Gemara, for sure, we determine the bottom line based on the heavenly voice, based on the baskol. Says Tosfos Vim Tomer, Maishna the lo kaim ke baskol the Rabbi Eliezer dazov. So how come we don't listen to the baskol in the story of Rabbi Eliezer back in Bava Metzia, Tanur Shalachnai? Wow. So Tosfos says that wasn't a reliable baskol. That was the problem. Rabbi Eliezer asked for it. If you ask for it and you're Rabbi Eliezer, so then Mishamayim, they're not going to turn you down. I mean, and then you'd look bad, right? So that it's coming to defend the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, but it wasn't coming unsolicited to go ahead and to determine halacha. Only unsolicited baskols do we listen to, but solicited baskols from people like Rabbi Eliezer, that we don't listen to. Wow, according to this answer of Tosfos, bottom line, do we listen to baskols? Yes, we do listen to baskols, except for the solicited kind. Yeah.
There is 6 machlokot between the Bet Shammai that was Bet Shammai. So where is the baskol?
It's a fair point, right? You're pointing out, in general, we do hold that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, but there are exceptions. So that makes sense. Right? That makes sense if the reason we pass like Beis Hillel is not because of the baskol. So then the Chacham said we pass like Beis Hillel. So then they have the right to come along and say, okay, except for here. What's that? Rambam doesn't talk about baskol specifically. He doesn't say the word baskol. So best of my knowledge. So I don't know what to say. If we pass it like Beis Hillel because of the baskol, so then I don't know. We have to figure out. Well, you're right. Why are there a few exceptions where we do paskin like Beis Shammai? Maybe the baskol had some exceptions. Maybe the baskol was before they had those machlokas. I don't know. Yeah.
Isn't there also one of the cases over there? He says, keep quiet because otherwise I'm makrif is kala ola.
Yeah.
So we see that and keep quiet.
So, but that's an interesting question. That account, I don't know if that account is in the Gemara. That account is in the davening. Yes, I don't know if it's meant to be 100% historical. But even if it is, that's not a halachic statement. That's a policy statement. That's like, what should we do? They're asking for advice. So just like you could ask the Urim Metumim for advice, right? David HaMelech wanted to know, am I going to win? Should I bother going out to battle? Am I going to win or lose? That's a question for the Urim Metumim. So that can be a question here too. Or when he says, if you keep quiet, so then that's like the Malachim were complaining. The Malachim are saying, we have a theological problem here. How could this be? And Hashem says, I don't want to, I can't, I'm not going to explain this. So keep quiet. But that's not determining halacha. Okay. So I think that's a little bit of a different thing. In any event, that is the first response of Tosfos. Tosfos has a second answer in the second line here. In source number 8, Tosfos says, Ve'od. Dehasam haisa keneged rabim v'atzora amra achrei rabim lahatos aval hacha ader rabbi Beis Hillel havu ruba So here Tosfos points out the following. In the story with Rabbi Eliezer and the machlokas about the Tanur Shel Achnai, the Baskol essentially contradicted a halachic principle. A halachic principle is we follow the majority. That's what Rabbi Yeshua, that's what the Gemara said. Kvar nitna Torah, the Torah was already given, and the principle is Achar Am Lahatos. Right here in the case of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, it was confirming a halachic principle because Beis Hillel were the majority. So the Gemara, so Tosfos says since Beis Hillel were the majority, so then but there was a lack of confidence because Beis Shammai was charifei tfei. They were really sharp. They were sharper than Beis Hillel, but Beis Hillel were the majority. So here it's kind of like the Baskol is just giving us the confidence to do what the halachic principle is anyway. So there we take confidence in the Baskol and we're going to go for it. We're gonna say halacha kebeis Hillel, as opposed to if the Baskol is contradicting a halachic principle. That's when we don't listen to Baskols. That's the second answer of Tosfos. So according to Tosfos don't give an absolute resolution, right? One opinion in Tosfos says we do listen to Baskols if they're unsolicited, and the other says no, we only listen to Baskols when it's just confirming what we know to be correct anyway, based on halachic principles. Yeah.
Going back to source 3, both of them. And going back to Yoshua, that it seemed to be quite a conflict. It could have asked, a resolution of the halachos that they forgot. But technically, as long as it doesn't go against principles.
Well, right. So there, it's not true. It's not contradicting a halachic principle, and nonetheless, Yoshua doesn't want to ask. Right? He says lo b'shamayim. He means we don't ask. We don't ask at all. So it's a fair ha'ara. So Tosfos' answer here that it is in consonance with the halachic. Maybe Tosfos' point is not just that it's not contradicting the halachic principle, but it's confirming what we already know to be true based on the halachic principle. Maybe that could be, yeah.
If you decide after a dozen times we follow the Shammai.
Right, yeah. Correct, yeah. If we're taking this answer of Tosfos, so then it's not really determined by the Baskol. That makes it easier to understand why there are exceptions where we pass on like Beis Hillel. According to the first answer of Tosfos, sounds like no, we pass on Beis Hillel because of the Baskol. Then it's a little bit tougher to understand, your point from before about the exceptional cases. In source number 9, there's another Gemara, and the Gemara says there were 3 times when Ruach HaKodesh made a difference in Beis Din. So the Gemara says it was number 1 in Beis Dino Shel Shem, Beis Dino Shel Shmuel Aramasi, Beis Dino Shel Shlomo HaMelech. So in Beis Dino Shel Shem, Gemara says what was going on? This was Yehuda and Tamar. So Yehuda wants to execute Tamar for having committed some sort of a form of quasi-adultery. So then she says, well, it's from the person who these items belong to, and Yehuda says, Sadka mimeni. So Gemara says, well, how did he know that was true? All he knew is that he had been with Tamar. How does that prove that no one else was? How does that prove that she's not pregnant with someone else? Maybe a lot of people came and visited Tamar. But so how does Yehuda know? He has no way to really know. So Gemara says it was Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh came out. Yehuda says, Tzadka, she's right that I was with her. But then the Ruach HaKodesh says, Mimeni, this is from me. I'm running the show here. The Hashgacha Pratis says. So that's how the Gemara determines it. And therefore, we're going to let Tamar off the hook. Similarly, in the Beis Din of Shmuel Aramasi, so Shmuel says to them, did I take anything from anyone? Did I abuse my power in any way? And everyone says no. But the Gemara points out the lashon there is lashon yachid. Vayomer aid. Should said vayomru. The people, lashon rabbim said yes, we are witness. So the Gemara says no. It was a Ruach HaKodesh came out and said Baskol came out and said ani aid. And Shlomo HaMelech, with the famous cases with the 2 women who claim that the baby is theirs, right? He has this great chap that the one who doesn't want to kill the baby, she must be the real mother. And how did he know? I mean, maybe Maybe not. Maybe, who knows? How is that an absolute proof? So Gemara says, a baskol came out. So we have in these situations where it seems to be that they relied on the baskol in determining real live shilas. How do we understand that? And there's a Mishnah in Maseches Yevamos in source number 10. And it says, it's talking about how do we know if we can let a woman remarry if her husband is no longer alive? Like, we don't have a body. So how do we know? What counts as proof that someone's dead? So it says here, Me'idin la'or haner v'l'or haLevana u'masiyin al pi baskol. We can allow her to marry based on a baskol. And the Gemara has a case where a person said, so-and-so is dead. And they went and they said, who's saying that? And they went and looked and they couldn't find anyone. They said, okay, we can rely on it anyway. We can let this man's wife remarry. Masiyan al pi baskol seems to be written into the halacha that we can trust the baskol. So there are many Mefarshim who say, no, baskol here, in this case in Yevamos, baskol doesn't mean a heavenly voice. Baskol means that someone said it, we just don't know who. So we have an anonymous voice. Anonymous voice is not always a heavenly voice. It means someone, they saw a guy, he said whatever, they don't know who he is, they tried to find him, they couldn't find him. That's the case. But it doesn't mean a heavenly voice. That's the Tosas Yantiv. Source number 11, I gave a quote from the Kovet Shiurim of Chanan Wasserman. He quotes this Tosas Yantiv, and he says, you don't need to say it that way because there's a difference between determining halacha and determining facts. And the bottom line is always an interaction between what the halacha is and what the facts are. Depending on the facts, that'll determine the bottom line. So here we can rely on a heavenly voice, we can rely on baskol to tell us the facts, not to tell us the halacha. So if the baskol comes out and says this man is dead, the baskol doesn't lie. Baskols don't lie. We can rely on a baskol. That's different than if a baskol comes out and says that the halacha is like such and such opinion. So to determine the halachic side of the determination, we don't rely on a baskol. To determine the factual side, which also has a practical ramification for the shayla, and that we can rely on the baskol. So there are going to be a difference of opinion here between various achronim. There were those who said, at least in determining facts, we can rely on baskol. There are those who say, in determining no aspect of halacha, can we rely on baskol. But it really seems to be a machlokas harishonim. Tosos thinks that it depends. Maybe unsolicited versus solicited. Maybe it depends on what the situation is in terms of baskol. Whereas, the Rambam doesn't discuss explicitly baskol, but he seems to leave no room whatsoever for any possibility of claiming, divine involvement in determining halachic policy, to the point that we're willing to go ahead to kill someone who claims to have an avuah to that effect. This is discussion that continues and filters down a little bit through the ages. Most people today don't claim to have Ruach HaKodesh anyway, or to hear baskols. So it's not so practical. But at the time of the Rishonim, there's actually one of the Rishonim, Rabbi Yaakov Mimeroish, if I pronounced that properly, I don't know. He's from Provence. And he writes an entire sefer called Shut Min HaShamayim. So it's a sefer of responsa, recording the halachic discussions he had with a malach, and the psakim that a malach gave him in these sort of communications mishamayim, and he records this in a halachic work. And this finds expression in practical halachic discussion. So we know the following. Maybe an example. There is a machlokas harishonim and halacha lemaisa machlokas between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. Do women say a bracha on a mitzvah asay shazman grum? All right, so Ashkenazim, our practice is that yes, women can opt into a mitzvah asay shazman grum, and they can say a bracha. A woman wants to say a bracha on lulav, on sukkah, on shofar, she can certainly do so. And the Sfardim, they say no, a woman can opt in, she can listen, she can pick up the lulav, but she cannot say a bracha on these mitzvahs. In Shut Min HaShamayim, he says that the Malach told him that certainly for shofar and for lulav, women can say a bracha. Shofar, the Gemara says, we blow shofar, Kedei sheyala zichronechem lefanai letova. so that I'll remember you well. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says on Rosh Hashanah, I'll remember you well. Women also need that. So therefore, for sure, women could say a bracha on shofar. Lulav represents the different types of the Jewish people coming together. V'chulei. Women are a part of that too. So no matter what you hold, women can certainly say a bracha on lulav. That's what it says in Shut Min HaShemayim. So the Chida was one of the greatest Sephardi poskim of the generations, and he brings this down lahalacha, and he says the only reason that in Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch, it goes in Karo Paskins that women don't say a bracha on any mitzvah cessation is man-gramas because he didn't see this Shut Min HaShemayim. If he would have seen this Shut Min HaShemayim, so then he would be modeh. He would agree, he would concede that at least for shofar and lulav, women can say bracha, and that's the chidas psak lahalacha. Women say a bracha on shofar and lulav, and not on other mitzvahs to say shaz man grama. And this was the practice in some Sephardi communities until modern times. Rav Ovadia Yosef does not like this, and he tries to change the minhag in all the various Sephardi communities that women should never say a bracha on mitzvahs to say shaz man grama. And he says, first of all, we don't paskin halacha based on communications with malachim. That's not how we do halacha lo b'shamayim. And second of all, you know what I think? I think that the malach told him that women say a bracha on it because he comes from that, Rav Yaakov Mimarosh came from that Masorah, which held that women always say a bracha on mitzvah to say shez magrama. So the malach was going with it. You know, the malach was saying, this is what you really hold anyway. And I'm going to give you extra reasons why women should say a bracha on these mitzvahs. But you know what? If the malach was talking to me, he would say no. So therefore, the bottom line is that women should not say a bracha on these mitzvahs. So that is a reflection of this whole discussion, even in more modern day halacha l'maisa. So this is, I think, a fascinating discussion again about the process of the giving of the Torah. So lo b'shamayim hi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, here it is. Now it's yours. You take it and run with it. And that's how halacha is determined. Rav Weiss quoted a beautiful Medrash where the Medrash describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu as giving over the Torah, giving himself with the Torah to the Jewish people. What does that mean? It's like he himself is subject to, along with it, he's given to the Jewish people. He's subject in the sense that he's subject to our determinations of the halacha based on our legitimately, honestly trying to go ahead and follow through on the halachic process. There is a further discussion as to the impact of Kabbalistic sources on determining the halacha. We'll try to do this quickly. I know the hour is getting a little bit later. We'll try to do this quickly. And here as well, now this is not exactly the same, not necessarily exactly the same discussion, because we're not talking about some sort of heavenly voice. We're not talking about asking the Urim V'Tumim. But nonetheless, a lot of times people wonder, are Kabbalistic sources part of the halachic, the halachic process? Are they outside of the halachic process? And there's no doubt that in different corners of the Torah world, that these sources have had different levels of impact in determining the bottom line. So one thing is for sure, across the Torah world, there's no doubt that Kabbalistic sources have significantly impacted Jewish practice. So whether it is in the number of windings of tzitzis, there's not an official number of windings between the knots that you have to do. The Shulchan Aruch says you can do however many you want, but it's a minimum to do 7, 9, 11, 13. 7
and 8 is okay, plus 11 is 26.
Okay. The Shulchan Aruch says it one way, the Mishnah Berurah comes along and says no, because the Arizal said 7, 8, 11, 13. I messed that up, and the Shulchan Aruch says 7, 8, and the Mishnah Berurah says 7, 9. I think I got it right. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch says 7, 9, 11, 13, and the Mishnah Berurah says no, it's 7, 8, 11, 13. That's based on this gematrias, and that's based on Kabbalistic sources. You can do kiddushin with anything that has any value. So the minhag is to use a ring. That's based on Kabbalistic sources. Everyone does that. There are a lot of things, plenty of times, where the Beis Yosef, where the Ramah brings something which is sourced in Kabbalah, in whether it's the Zohar, whether it's the Arizal, So the Rizal mostly less of an impact on Beis Yosef and the Rama. We're contemporaries of the Rizal, really, but certainly they do quote him once in a while, the Beis Yosef at least, and later poskim certainly bring the Rizal to bear. But the Zohar is the most influential Kabbalistic source, and there are others as well. Kiddush Levana, the standard Ashkenazi practice is we'll do Kiddush Levana as long as it's already 72 hours after the Molad. But the Sfardim and Hasidim wait 7 days after the Molad. That's based on the Sefer Sharei Ora, which is a Kabbalistic work. So and it's based on Kabbalistic considerations. It's not. The Gemara doesn't indicate that at all. The Gemara has one opinion which says you can't do it 7 days after; it's too late. And nonetheless, these communities wait until 7 days after, and that's based on Kabbalistic. What is the level of impact that we have? This does seem to be. There is a little bit of a difference between the Beis Yosef and the Ramah, and then again, this will be filtered down differently into different communities within the Torah world. So in section Bet, Olam HaKabbalah, Bashbato Olam HaLachad, Beis Yosef here is discussing the topic of saying one or two brachos when you put on your tefillin. So this is a machlokas Rishonim how to read the Gemara. Right, the Gemara says that you say the bracha of laniach tefillin when you put on your shel yad. Laniach tefillin on the shel yad and mitzvah al mitzvah tefillin on the shel rosh. But one group of Rishonim says al mitzvah tefillin on the shel rosh only if you made a hefsek between the shel yad and shel rosh, or if you're not putting on the shel yad, then you'll say al mitzvah on the shel rosh. But if you're putting on them both one after another, which is the standard of what you're supposed to do, so then laniach covers the shel yad and the shel rosh. And in fact, Sfardim generally say one bracha when they put on their tefillin, just laniach. We Ashkenazim, Tosas holds, no, you say one bracha the shel that's laniach, that goes on both the shel yad and the shel rosh, but the shel rosh gets two brachos, laniach and al mitzvahs. So when we put on al shel rosh, we'll say another bracha al mitzvahs. If you're just putting on the shel rosh, you would say two brachos, laniach and al mitzvahs on the shel rosh. So in the discussion of this topic, the Beis Yosef, look at the second paragraph of the Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef quotes the Agur, who quotes from the Zohar that one bracha for both. That's it. You don't say two brachas when you put on your tefillin in the morning, and that's because the shel rosh represents zachor and the shel yad is shamar and zachor v'shamar b'dibur echad. Not normal type of halachic proof or halachic reasoning. It's based on a Kabbalistic concept, and the Agur says, I can't believe that people don't just now that the Zohar we found that the Zohar says this. How could anyone disagree with that? So in the second paragraph, the Beis Yosef says, I don't know why you're so shocked. There are various things in the Zohar that are against the Gemara, against the poskim, and we go by the Gemara. And in fact, the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you know what? He's quoted in the Gemara too. We don't always pass like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon, some say it's stronger than Beis Yosef. The halach is Rabbi Shimon versus Rabbi Yehuda, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. So just because it's in the Zohar, does that mean we have to follow it? The Beis Yosef paskins this way anyway, not because it's in the Zohar, but because that's the opinion of the Rif and the Rambam. And therefore, the Beis Yosef says we follow the Rif and the Rambam. We say one bracha when you put on your shel yad and your shel rosh at the same time. The Ramah and the Darkei Moshe says, no, we actually follow the opinion of Tosfos, and we say two brachas when you follow your preparing tefillah at the same time. So here, there's not a dispute. There is a dispute halacha l'maisa. There's not a dispute between the Beis Yosef and the Ramah. Do we go ahead and have to throw out everything we knew until now if we find a Zohar that contradicts what it says in the Gemara? Beis Yosef says, the Rishonim who said you say two brachos, that's their reading of the Gemara. So therefore, they don't have to go ahead and change what they hold just because that's what it says in the Zohar. But in source number 3, we have a different example. Here we're talking about a person who gets an aliyah reading along with the Baal Koreh. So the Rosh says, if you get an aliyah, you don't read along with the Baal Koreh, it's a bracha levatala. Because you're the one saying the bracha. That means you have to read the actual aliyah. You have to read the psukim. So the Rosh says you absolutely must read along with the Baal Koreh. Beis Yosef here quotes from the Zohar that absolutely only one person can read, not two people. So he says in the underlying part of the following, Af al pi shalidivya poskim tzarich likros v'lo yikra kasu dami bracha levatala me'achar shalom niskar zeh betalma behedya lo shavkiron divrei azar mepei divrei poskim. He says this is not discussed in the Gemara explicitly that the Ola has to read along with the Baal Koreh, probably because they didn't have a Baal Koreh at the time of the Gemara. Everyone just read their own aliyah. So it's not discussed in the Gemara. So even though the poskim say it, but I have a source that outranks the poskim, the Zohar. And the Zohar says you don't read along with the Baal Koreh, and therefore you don't read along with the Baal Koreh. The Beis Yosef makes a little bit of a pshara. He says, well, if you just mouth the words along with the Baal Koreh, then maybe the Zohar wouldn't have a problem with that. So fine. So mouth the words along with the Baal Koreh. That's what the Beis Yosef says. Comes along the Rama and says, "Ve'ein lazuz midivrei haposkim, afim hayu divrei hazor cholkim alam." I'm reading the underlined part here. Kei nirali delo Beis Yosef. Rama says no. Not only do we go by the Gemara against the Zohar, we go by the poskim. He means Rishonim against the Zohar. If that is how they understand the halacha, then the fact that the Zohar says otherwise doesn't move me. And therefore, the Rambam says, no, you should read along with the Baal Koreh. Now, the machlokas here practically is very slight. The machlokas is, should the Ola read along in a way that's audible to himself but not to others? That's the opinion of the Rama. Or the Beis Yosef says it shouldn't even be audible to himself. He should just mouth the words. So the difference is very, very slight. But the methodological point is very significant. The Beis Yosef says, Zohar versus the poskim will follow the Zohar, and the Ramah says not necessarily. No, the poskim they're the ones who determine our psak halacha, regardless of what it says in the Zohar. You see this in source number 5 and 6 as well. The Beis Yosef says, what about a yachid saying kedushas yotzer? Kedushas yotzer is in Birchas Kriya Shema, where we say kadosh kadosh baruch kavod. So apparently it says. He says, even though the minhag ha'olam is that a yachid says it, he says, nonetheless, that's not explicit in the Gemara, and the Zohar says not to, so that's it. We should not do it. And the Ramah says that we don't have to go ahead and listen to the Zohar, even though it's not in the Gemara, it is in Maseches Sofrim, and that is good enough. Rav Ovadia claims that the Beis Yosef would agree that the poskim win if it's not in the Zohar. Let's say it's in later Kabbalah. Let's say it's the Arizal versus what it says in the poskim. So then we would follow what it says in the poskim, as opposed to what it says in the Arizal. And Rav Mordechai Eliyahu was not so sure about this. This actually became as well a sticking point, halacha l'maisa, in later generations as well. So firstly, again, there's definitely influence across the board, all sectors of Torah society. There's influence of Kabbalistic sources in our bottom line in some ways or other. But the question is, if you have something which is, let's say, in the Zohar, which is not in the Gemara at all, so then a lot of times it will be adopted. Let's say it's against what it says in the Gemara, then we pass it like the Gemara. Let's say it's not against the Gemara, but it's against the poskim, or let's say there's machlokas at poskim, and it says one way in the Zohar. Let's say it's not the Zohar, let's say it's the Arizal. So then there are different parts of the Torah world, and they do different things. The Sfardim and Chassidim are much more likely to follow the Kabbalistic sources, the non-Hasidic Ashkenazic world less likely, but it's hard to give exact klalim. The Ben Ish Chai, one of the most influential Sfardi poskim, 1800s, very early 1900s, so he very much took into account made a wide range of Kabbalistic sources. The Zohar, the Arizal, says we'll pass it like the Arizal against what it says in Shulchan Aruch, even when it comes to brachos. And he gives rayas. He says, look around at the world. This is what we do. In Shulchan Aruch, it says not to say the bracha of Hanosen Layav Koch. Of all the Birchos HaShachar, they're all in the Gemara except for that one. Hanosen Layav Koch is not in the Gemara. The Beis Yosef says it's not in the Gemara. Don't say it. And the Ramah says, no, our minhag is to say it. So fine, Ashkenazim, even though it doesn't say it in the Gemara, we're willing to say this bracha. And the Chaber says not to. Even Sfardim say Hanosen Layav Koch today. That's because the Arizal was into it. Spanish Chai says, you see what happened, the Arizal wins. Even over what it says in Shulchan Aruch, and even in the case of Safek Brachos La'akel. Can you say Birchos Kriya Shema after Zman Tefillah? Let's say a person's davening after he's done by Zman Tefillah. A person is chayav to say Kriya Shema by Zman Kriya Shema and to say Shemona Esrei by Zman Tefillah, and let's say he's late. So you can still daven until Chatzos Hayom. But the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, you could say Shemona Esrei until Chatzos Hayom. You cannot say Birchos Kriya Shema. Once Zman Tefillah is over, that's it. You lost. You can't say Zman Kriya Shema anymore. You can't say Birchos Kriya Shema anymore. And the Ben Ish Chai says, okay, that's nice, but the Arizal says you can, so you can. Now, it's not just the Arizal. The Mishnah Berurah also quotes in the Be'er Halacha. There are poskim who think you can. It's not just the Arizal, but the Ben Ish Chai says that's why we do it. People, the minute golem is people will say Birchas Kriya Shema even after Zman Tefillah until Chatzos Hayom. That's because of the Arizal. He says we always go by the Arizal. It is Yadua, and it was controversial that Rav Ovadia Yosef has an entire sefer that he wrote in his younger years, basically going Kiseder, disagreeing with the Ben Ish Chai. And a lot of his disagreements are stripping away the instances where the Ben Ish Chai paskins against the Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch based on Kabbalistic sources. And he takes away all those psakim, and he says, no, we go by the Mechaber. Not that Rav Ovadia doesn't ever, give room for that as well, but he's much less. He takes away a lot of these psakim. Now, the one who was a contemporary of Rav Ovadia, who was very much a follower of the Ben Ish Chai, was Mordechai Eliyahu. And Mordechai Eliyahu says, anytime you have the Kabbalistic sources that seem to go against the poskim, well, let's figure out how the poskim really mean like the Kabbalistic sources. The Kabbalistic sources are right. And he even gives an explanation. He says, it says by Matan Torah that Hashem speaks kol gadol v'lo yasaf. Lo yasaf means unceasing. And that's because there's like an ongoing revelation over the course of history. And that's reflected in the Kabbalistic sources. It's just a question of what the generation is ready for. And as history moves on, so everything will be adopted from the Kabbalistic sources. So says Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, and it's just a question of timing. What about Lo Bashamayim? He says this is not a question of Lo Bashamayim. The great Kabbalists were also great poskim, and so they know that it works al pi halacha as well. So here, I'm not sure that it's the same discussion as Lo Bashamayim. I don't know, because on the one hand, usually, Kabbalah is not doing the same thing as halacha. It's not telling you, here's the psak, here's what it's giving insight. But the question is, can we take that into determination within halacha discussions when we have, to what extent do we take that? Now, sometimes it's not a machlokes, it's not a contradiction at all. The halacha doesn't say to use a ring or not to use a ring. So if the Zohar says to use a ring to do kiddushin seder, that has nothing to do with lo b'shemayim. But when you're determining halacha, so that's perhaps can be related to our discussion. We're not just using halachic klalim, we're using insights based on Kabbalah to figure out what to do. So the question is that part of Lo Bashamayim, and we don't do that at all? Is it an exception to Lo Bashamayim because this is part of the revelation itself? Or it's not a problem because the great poskim are also great in Kabbalah, and they're finding the right balance in terms of taking this down, filtering this down la halacha. So in any event, I think an interesting discussion, which really highlights the connection, the relationship, the active role that Kadosh Baruch Hu assigns to the Jewish people in determining halacha, in developing Torah. We should hopefully do our best to live up to this task in an honest way. Yes.
It's probably the first is stripped out. We have all of them, only follow the halacha. So the law, even though he was a Levi, he never went out to wash the hands of the Kohanim during the Kohanim. And they says that will be him washing the hands of things under the Zohar. So the Rav gave other excuses, why he didn't do it. But I think because he felt it was more important to stay inside and answer this going to answer it than to go out there.
Okay, I don't know. Certainly, all of the Rav's Hanhagos, and to the extent that he systematically stripped away everything in that because of Kabbalistic briskers in general. Yeah, there's in the non-Hasidic Ashkenazic world, certainly it has less sway. But even so, there's nobody who strips away everything. There certainly are influences. There definitely are influences. But here, the Rav probably thought it's against his concept because there's a shot. So that's why he didn't want to do it. Okay, so
when he got it, he wakes up loud. Yeah, everybody heard him.
Right. I assume that I've heard that before. I assume that's against both the Mechaber and the Rav. I assume he was doing that as an educational point because people didn't know the halacha and he wanted to make that point. And maybe that's what it is. But I'm not really a fan of other people who are not celebrating doing that because they don't need to make that point and it's against what it says in Torah. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Have an amazing day.
I think maybe what it is that if you